Upon discovering my pregnancy, my husband's ex-wife intentionally started a fire in an effort to kill me. Instead of calling for help, I saved his mother, who had fainted from the smoke, ensuring her survival. In my previous life, I had screamed for help during the blaze, prompting others to rescue me and his mother first. In a fit of rage to outdo me, his ex-wife re-entered the inferno and eventually succumbed to severe burns. After her death, he admitted that she had started the fire intentionally and declared that her demise was no tragedy. He initially treated me, who was terrified, with care. But once our child was born, he brutally killed the baby using a stone tablet, shouting, "It's all your fault! Because of you and your daughter, I lost the one I loved. Go to hell and repent for your sins." In utter despair, I chose to die alongside him. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in the fire. A familiar voice startled me awake, shouting, "Hold on! I'll get you out." I was drenched in cold sweat as I regained consciousness. The charred wooden door, weakened by the flames, crashed down just inches from my face. Panicked, I quickly led his mother into the bedroom, instructing, "Mom, don't open the windows. The fire will spread." Scanning the room, I tore open a pillowcase, soaked it with mineral water, and handed it to her, motioning for her to cover her nose and mouth. At that moment, the sound of sirens echoed from outside, and her face lit up with relief. "Don't worry," she said. "He's here with help. We'll be fine." Watching her hopeful expression, I lowered my gaze, unable to tell her that in the future, her son would harm his own daughter for the sake of his lover. The room grew hotter as the fire intensified, and the floor tiles burned underfoot. After helping his mother to a safer spot, I heard his voice outside. "Are you in there? Don't worry, I'm here to save you." The door burst open with a loud crash. Through the flames, my vision blurred, but I could hear Serafina's cries for help. "Brother, I'm on the balcony. I'm scared." His voice commanded, "Everyone, follow me to the balcony to rescue her. Don't waste time searching the house." His mother, overhearing their conversation, clutched her chest, gasping. "He's abandoning us," she murmured before fainting, her eyes rolling back. Through the smoke, I saw him carrying Serafina away, leaving the flames to consume everything behind them. My tears evaporated instantly in the heat. Fighting the urge to scream for help, I muttered to myself, "I owe you nothing in this life." Carrying his mother on my back, I struggled through the fire despite the searing pain in my abdomen. With his baby in my arms and his mother clinging to me, I stood amidst the inferno, hearing their voices grow distant. "Is anyone else in the house?" he asked. "No," Serafina replied. "His wife said she was fragile and locked herself inside before setting the fire. She ran away after that. I'll make her pay if I catch her." Weak and almost collapsing, I heard another voice insist, "I think someone's still in the bedroom. We should check." But Serafina interjected, "She wouldn't stay there after causing harm. Let's go. We need to get me to the hospital." With unbearable pain and trembling limbs, I tried to push through the fire. His mother, regaining consciousness, clung to me and screamed, "You little bastard! Your wife and child are inside and you're saving her instead?" I froze, listening for footsteps, but they had already faded away. The wardrobe, deformed by heat, crashed down, sealing off the exit. I handed his mother the last of the water, soaked into a towel. She looked at me, tears welling up, but couldn't speak as the sirens blared again outside. He was gone with Serafina. The fire intensified, and I thought, I won't make it out this time. As the flames consumed the room, his mother coughed a few times before falling silent. The fire licked at my clothes when a voice called from outside. "Sister-in-law! The security guard said he didn't see you leave. Are you still inside?" Overcome with emotion, I shouted in response. Moments later, a figure charged through the fire wielding an extinguisher, but soon collapsed. When I regained consciousness, I was safely outside with his mother. Our rescuer, his colleague Gideon, was nearby, his face blackened with soot. He smiled faintly and said, "I told you I heard voices." Serafina swore no one was inside. Then he fainted. Onlookers called for ambulances. None of us had severe injuries except his mother, who had underlying conditions, and Gideon, who remained unconscious from smoke inhalation. When he arrived at the hospital and saw me, his face twisted in rage. Ignoring the nurse's protests, he slapped me and shouted, "How could you be so cruel? Why did you try to harm Serafina? You weren't even at home. So why did you return to the fire? Do you realize you nearly cost Gideon his life as well? I truly can't believe I married someone like you." If anything happens to them, it will be entirely your fault. You'll be a murderer. Struggling to stay conscious, I barely had time to react before he shoved me to the floor. Meanwhile, Serafina timidly peered out from behind his sister. Allah, I know you despise me, she said, her voice frail. But have you considered how many people your actions will hurt? She then leaned weakly on his shoulder, coughing violently and spitting up blood. Thaddeus turned, fury etched on his face, and kicked me back down just as I was getting to my feet. Why didn't you perish in the fire? He snarled. I should have dragged Gideon away and let you burn. His eyes burned with anger as he stared down at me, while Serafina, nestled in his arms, wore a look of smug defiance. Lying there, blood pooling beneath me, I could feel the pain tearing through me. Tears streamed down my face as my burned throat rasped out a few broken words. Doctor! Call a doctor! Seeing me like this, Thaddeus sneered cruelly. Doctor? Do you think others will have a chance to see one if they die because of you? His words cut deeper than the pain in my body. I stared at him, my chest heavy with sorrow. Before Serafina appeared, he had eagerly awaited this child's arrival, decorating a nursery and even choosing the name Thaddeus Jr. He'd once called giving the child his name the greatest gift. Now, as blood seeped beneath me, he turned away, shielding Serafina's eyes. Don't look. It's disgusting, he muttered. When I awoke, I was in another room. A nurse, noticing I was conscious, angrily threw a medication bottle into the trash. You're unbelievably lucky, she spat. After all the people you've hurt, all you've lost is a baby. My throat felt like it was on fire, leaving me unable to respond. Ignoring my silence, she stormed to the door, flinging it open. The suspect is awake, she shouted to those outside. Take her away immediately. Don't let her taint this hospital. Her voice dripped with contempt as she added, You dared to harm the child of a hero. How weren't you burned to death? Two people entered, pulling me up without a word. Soon I was seated across from Thaddeus, whose expression was grim. His voice was cold as he said, You're heartless and attempted murder. Because you're pregnant, I can push for probation. But you're going to prison. He turned his head sharply, as though even looking at me would tarnish him. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but my hoarse voice could only produce a violent cough. At that moment, Serafina burst in, tears streaming down her face, and threw herself into his arms. Brother Thaddeus, I had another nightmare, she cried. I dreamt of burning in the fire. I was so scared. His expression, which had momentarily softened, darkened again. Allah, he said sternly, how could you torment someone like Serafina? Why are you so intent on hurting her? His voice trembled as he continued, Father died trying to rescue people, and for the daughter of a hero, you... Unable to finish, he slammed his fists on the table. I took a sip of water, letting the warmth soothe my throat before saying, I didn't start the fire. Serafina did. She's the one who should be in prison. Thaddeus slammed the table again, leaning toward me with piercing eyes. Serafina is kind and innocent. How dare you slander her? She told me what happened. It was you. You set the fire deliberately. Serafina began crying again. Brother Thaddeus, she sobbed. She's trying to frame me again. I just want to stay by your side as your sister. Is that so wrong? She leaned toward me, shaking my arm, but I recoiled in disgust. Stumbling backward, she screamed, Brother Thaddeus, help me! She pushed me. Thaddeus rushed to her side, catching her in one arm while grabbing me with the other and slamming me to the ground. How dare you harm her in front of me? He roared. If the law allowed it, I'd send you to prison right now to reflect on your actions. I looked up at his face, still familiar, still the same as when he made me promises. But now, all illusions I once had were gone. In my previous life, Serafina had committed suicide, and he had accused me of being the murderer. In this life, she was alive, yet he still blamed me for everything. I finally spoke, my voice cold and devoid of hope. Thaddeus, let's divorce. Sue me if you want. The baby's gone, so try sending me to prison. His brows furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? The baby is gone? He asked. Looking at his shocked face, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. It means our baby is dead. After I saved your mother and you kicked me out, our child died. His expression turned to disbelief, but Serafina quickly interrupted. Don't believe her lies. She probably hurt someone else's baby, and use this as an excuse to cover it up. Her words made me laugh uncontrollably. So now I'm capable of anything? You think I nearly burned myself alive just to fake a miscarriage? Flustered, Serafina began crying again. Brother Thaddeus, she's lying. Why is she always so cruel to me? She tried to nestle into his arms, but he didn't move, instead staring intently at my stomach. We've both been looking forward to this baby, he murmured. I know, no matter what, you wouldn't harm your own child. His voice softened. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just lost control. I'm sorry. But I shook my head. I don't want your apologies. If you think I started the fire, have me investigated. Thaddeus clenched his fists, his voice uneasy. You're weak now. Go rest. Serafina suddenly swayed dramatically. Brother Thaddeus, she cried, she almost killed me. If my parents were alive, they'd never let me suffer like this. His expression hardened as he listened to her sobs. Serafina's parents had once saved his life, and since their passing, he had taken care of her. He spent all our savings on her, a car, a house, and luxury items. Even after his parents became wealthy, she relied on him completely, calling for help with everything from light bulbs to clogged drains. Anytime I brought up these sacrifices, she cried and mentioned her late parents. Once I felt conflicted, unsure if I was being unfair. But now I see things clearly. Her parents saved him, not me. If he wants to repay their kindness by sacrificing everything for her, that's his choice. But I refused to be the villain in this marriage any longer. I couldn't bear to watch any longer, so I stood up and announced, I'm hiring a lawyer to prepare the divorce papers. From now on, we'll go our separate ways. Serafina, leaning against Thaddeus's chest, looked up at him in disbelief. For the first time, Thaddeus pushed Serafina away, his eyes wide with shock as he grabbed my arm. Allah, say that again and I dare you, he demanded. I stood firm, meeting his gaze without flinching. My voice, devoid of emotion, carried no trace of warmth. We're getting a divorce. I don't need your approval. His expression contorted with anger as he gripped my wrist tightly. His voice carried a sharp edge. You need to wake up, Ayla. You're the one who caused this mess, and I haven't even blamed you yet. How dare you talk about divorce? Fine. I'll convince Serafina to issue a letter of understanding, and we'll put this nonsense to rest. I never intended for this to happen to the baby. I'll protect you. I laughed bitterly at his serious tone. This man had accused me of arson without hesitation, yet here he was, claiming he would protect me. Thaddeus, I don't need anyone to protect me. I didn't start the fire, so go ahead, investigate all you want. As I turned to leave, his grip tightened. His eyes reflected confusion and exhaustion, as though he was torn about what to do. You're an adult, Ayla. How can you be less reasonable than Serafina, who's just a child? Serafina's eyes glinted with resentment, but upon hearing his words, she feigned a look of grievance. Brother Thaddeus, if you feel that way, then I'm willing to forgive her for your sake. I won't press charges, but I worry about what unpredictable things she might do in the future. You promised Mom and Dad that you'd never let me suffer. I froze, watching the exchange. At the mention of her parents, Thaddeus's expression shifted multiple times before he seemed to reach a decision. Allah, I'm sorry, but I can't let Serafina suffer. With that, he took her by the hand and left, slamming the door shut behind him. I stared at the locked door, pressing my lips into a thin line. This was my husband, someone who claimed he'd help me, but in his heart, already believed I was a murderer. After apologizing, he immediately left me locked in an interrogation room. It was absurd. For 2 entire days, I was deprived of water and food. I didn't need to think twice to know it was Serafina's doing. As the child of a martyr, people instinctively sided with her, viewing her as righteous while despising me. Before I passed out from hunger, I had seen her stumble toward oncoming traffic. At that time, I hadn't yet seen her true colors and thought of her as a helpless child. Shocked, I froze, and the can of chicken soup I had brought fell from my hands, spilling hot liquid onto my leg. Moments later, Thaddeus shoved me to the ground as Serafina's voice rang out. Sister Ayla, why did you push me? That day, Thaddeus slammed his fist against a tree in anger, causing leaves and dust to swirl around us, stinging my eyes and making me cough. I tried to explain, but he refused to listen. He drove me home, locked the door, and left me to reflect. Reflect on what? It was then that I realized how much their dynamic had shifted. No matter how I cried or protested, he wouldn't believe me. When I demanded to see the surveillance footage, he stormed out, slamming the door in my face. You've already hurt Serafina, he said before leaving. Do you want her to think I don't trust her too? I only see her as a little sister. Why can't you let her be? Tears streamed down my face as I recalled another incident. Serafina falling down the stairs. Thaddeus's brows knitted together, his gaze cold as ice. I told you to stay away from her. Why did you do it? He accused. You're being completely unreasonable. Don't be afraid, Serafina, he said, lifting her onto his shoulder. I'll take you to the hospital. As they left, Serafina glanced back at me, a mocking smile playing on her lips. That was the day I first thought about divorce. It was also the day I found out I was pregnant. Like many women, I had clung to the hope that a child would change things. But now he had destroyed that hope with his own hands. I finally understood he would never change. I couldn't let myself be trapped between them any longer. But before I left, I had to reclaim something. When I next opened my eyes, the hospital's sterile white walls surrounded me. The nurse muttered under her breath about how senseless the world was, how the people who harmed others lived while those who saved lives never woke up. My mother-in-law was lying nearby, and Thaddeus had dropped the charges, which was laughable. Forcing myself to sit up, I fixed my gaze on the nurse. You're Serafina's friend, aren't you? She might withdraw her case, but I won't. Rolling her eyes, the nurse left. Moments later, Thaddeus rushed in, looking drained. Allah, can you stop causing trouble? Do you know how much effort it took to convince Serafina to drop the charges? She's forgiven you, so what more do you want? I stared coldly at him, remaining silent. Shock flickered across his face as he took in my pale appearance. His tone softened. It's fine. The nurse said you're not seriously hurt. Just apologize to Serafina, and this will all be over. Apologize to her? I asked, laughing bitterly. I want her in jail. Thaddeus lost his temper, grabbing me by the collar. The veins in his hands bulged as he tried to control his anger. Why are you being so unreasonable? Have you lost your mind? I've done so much for you, and you're still fixated on Serafina. Without flinching, I reached under my pillow and handed him signed divorce papers. I'm done, Thaddeus. Serafina set the fire and tried to kill us. If you can't see that, I have nothing left to say. He didn't even glance at the papers, tearing them apart and throwing the pieces at me. You have no humanity, no conscience. After everything I've done, how dare you treat me like this? Before I could respond, a nurse called from the doorway. Thaddeus, your mother is awake. His grip on me loosened instantly and he rushed out of the room. Summoning all my strength, I followed him to her bedside. Thaddeus knelt beside her, his back tense. Mom, you've finally woken up. Don't blame Ayla. She's just confused. I've been too lenient with her. Thaddeus's mother's eyes rolled, and in the next moment, a sharp slap landed on Thaddeus's face, sending him tumbling to the floor. Clutching his rapidly swelling cheek, he stared up at her, stunned. Mom, I know you're angry, but Ayla has lost the baby. I can't let her face any further harm right now. Standing at the doorway, I smirked at his cluelessness. He truly thought his mother hit him because he had married the wrong person. Thaddeus's mother narrowed her eyes, her expression filled with helplessness and disappointment. Don't give me that nonsense about arson. Ayla was with me the entire day. How could she have set the fire? Thaddeus froze, stammering after a long pause. But Serafina said Ayla asked her to come to the house and deliberately set the fire to kill her. At this, his mother kicked him square in the chest. How could I have raised such a fool? Don't you understand what I'm saying? Ayla and I were together when you carried Serafina out in your arms. And Serafina herself said no one else was in the house. Ayla gave me the last of the water, which saved my life. Thaddeus's pupils widened in disbelief, and he collapsed onto the floor, motionless for a long time. His mother glanced at me standing in the doorway and waved me over. My heart churned with a mix of emotions, but I finally stepped forward, my voice trembling. Mom. Aunt. Her tears flowed instantly as if something had snapped inside her. She stood abruptly and began kicking and hitting Thaddeus. What is wrong with you? I never said there was anything wrong with Serafina. So why did you throw everything away for her, when you could have had a proper wife? Amidst the chaos, Serafina suddenly appeared, her voice ringing out. Brother Thaddeus? Thaddeus turned toward her, his eyes bloodshot. Serafina, how could you be so cruel? Serafina faltered, taking a step back as her lips quivered, quickly trying to think of an excuse. Brother Thaddeus, don't listen to them. Ayla set the fire. I saw it myself. Thaddeus's hand lashed out, slapping her across the face. My own mother said it was you who started the fire. Why would she lie to me? Serafina stumbled, tears streaming down her face. Maybe your mother is lying to protect her, she stammered. Before she could finish, Thaddeus shoved her aside, sending her sprawling to the ground. Clutching her face, Serafina muttered, If my parents were alive, they'd be heartbroken to see you treating me like this. Thaddeus stood there, fists clenched, but ultimately let out a deep sigh. It was only then that he seemed to remember me. He reached out, his tone pleading. Allah, can you forgive Serafina? I let out a bitter laugh. As expected, the goodwill of Serafina's parents was Thaddeus's ultimate weakness. Even after learning the truth, his instinct was to plead for her. I struggled to speak, my voice barely audible. Thaddeus, let's get a divorce. His eyes immediately turned red as he grabbed my hand, shaking it in desperation. Allah, I misunderstood you. It's all my fault. Please don't leave me. I love you. I pulled my hand free, stepping back as I stared at him coldly. You don't love me, Thaddeus. You love Serafina. I will not only pursue a divorce, but I'll also see to it that justice is served for the baby and the fire. Leaning against the wall, Serafina collapsed dramatically, but I didn't even glance at her. I turned and left. The house was completely destroyed by the fire, so I checked into a random hotel. I had barely settled in when there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Thaddeus stood there looking haggard. Allah, let's talk. I smiled faintly. There's nothing to discuss except our divorce. His eyes reddened again and he forced his way into the room. Allah, I was wrong before. Please forgive me. Let's go back to how things used to be. I sighed softly. And what about Serafina? He froze, his face blank. I continued. I heard that after I left, she told everyone she's pregnant with your child. Thaddeus trembled violently before stammering. I'll make her get an abortion. It was a mistake. I've wronged you, but please give me another chance. I shook my head. When I was left to die in that fire, when our baby was crushed to death, did you think about second chances then? I clung to the belief that you'd eventually see my worth, but I was wrong. Those happy moments we had are long gone. You're no longer the Thaddeus I once loved, and I'm no longer the girl who let others trample over her. We can't go back. I walked over to the table, picked up the freshly printed divorce papers, and handed them to him. Sign it. He snatched the papers, tears streaming down his face. Do we really have to go this far? We used to love each other so much. His voice broke, but I felt nothing. Once bold and confident, the man before me now seemed small and afraid. After a few moments of silence, Thaddeus slumped in defeat. I didn't know, he whispered, tears falling. I didn't know you were being framed. It was all Serafina's lies. I looked at him coolly. Do you believe everything she says? If not for Gideon, both your mother and I would have died in that fire. Would you have investigated our deaths? No. You'd have told the world it was an accident to protect Serafina. He covered his face, sitting in silence. After what felt like an eternity, he signed the papers and left. We agreed to finalize the divorce a week later. On the appointed day, I arrived calm and collected, dressed in new clothes. Thaddeus looked worn out, his red eyes filled with sorrow as he approached. Allah, are we really? I cut him off. We're done, Thaddeus. There's no going back. He said no more and left me the house, car, and savings without hesitation. I immediately filed an appeal against Serafina. Arson is a crime, and she wouldn't escape justice. When I saw Serafina again, she was clinging to Thaddeus, pleading. Brother Thaddeus, I can't go to jail. My parents wouldn't want this. He shoved her away, his voice cold. Your parents would be ashamed of what you've become. Her face froze, but upon seeing me, she screamed, Why can't you leave me alone? Thaddeus gave you everything. What more do you want? The truth, I replied. Surveillance footage will prove what happened. Serafina paled. Impossible. Everything burned in the fire. If you had proof, you'd have shown it already. I smiled faintly. Footage can be stored online. It wasn't that I couldn't access it. It was that I wasn't given the chance. Thaddeus closed his eyes, resigned. Serafina lunged at me in rage, but I kicked her away. You've accused me of hitting you before. Now I'm just returning the favor. Serafina was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though her term would begin after she gave birth. Thaddeus lost his job and was blacklisted from his profession for negligence. Despite her efforts to marry him, Thaddeus forced her to terminate the pregnancy. Free from their drama, I've rebuilt my life. I now run a small business and feel more fulfilled than ever. I'll never go back to that dark chapter of my life. Whatever their future holds, mine is bright